Greetings friends, you are on the Military Reports channel, and today we will discuss with you the situation in Ukraine on the 5th of April 2024 year. A lot of events have taken place today, if geolocation, promotions, adjustments along the front line are of interest. So let's get started, and we will start with you from the most interesting direction, the most intense direction. This is of course, the direction of the Yar clock. As you can see, there are a huge number of geolocations. Every geolocation knows something. One means a video, somewhere a post, somewhere interesting thoughts. Let's discuss in detail and try to understand what really happened here in the chapel direction, from the evening of the 4th of April to the morning of the 5th of April. Today, the 67th Mechanized Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, here are 67s, responsible for the defense of the canal, but this quarter on the eastern part of the Yaroslavl, published footage of the role of the offensive of the armed forces of the Russian Federation in this direction. The 67th Brigade indicates that during the offensive, they managed to repel this attack. Frames. The shooting was conducted at night. In these frames, we see with you the movement of a column of Russian armored vehicles moving at a very accelerated pace, which moves almost unhindered without any resistance from the AFU, and sometimes some artillery strikes flash by. This column comes already to the outskirts of the Yar clock, and then we publish footage of the landing itself. A few boxes went in one direction, a few in another. Here is the landing of the troops already on the easternmost outskirts of the Yar clock, and only then the shelling of these positions begins. We see with you the positions of the AFU and the fighters of the ISU, who meet the Russian fighters with fire. Apparently with you an attempt to land, gain a foothold in the trenches. Apparently, you have belated attacks of the multiple launch rocket system from the AFU, which are already hitting just in the milk where it is not necessary. And already the shots in the morning, attempts to gain a foothold and storm the trenches, and in principle, the shots have ended. In other words, the footage is very fast. It is very difficult to understand what really happened, how it happened. I'm going to try to explain everything to you in detail now, so that you just understand how this operation was carried out, how the Russian troops managed to gain a foothold on the eastern outskirts of the Yar clock. Well, let's start from the beginning. According to the video, the Russian column was moving along the Highway 0506 from the side of Kromov. The Russian column was moving along this road, and as soon as the Russian army reached approximately the new cemetery, the Russian column, the equipment moved off the Highway 0506, probably due to the fact that, after all, most likely either the territory along the railway is still under the control of the AFU, or it is still in the gray zone, or there are risks of simply falling under some kind of counterstrike. Therefore, it was not possible to move further along 0506, as I understand it, into the columns, since there was still most likely the probability of a possible strike from somewhere from this direction, with the use of an anti-tank against a chain or something else like that. Therefore, having reached the cemetery, the column turns south and begins to move already, let's say, along the southern part of the cemetery and along, let's say, south of Route 0506. Here was a small open area, probably the most risky terrain, but quickly enough the column overcame this small area, and again the column turns to the south, and most importantly crosses this forest belt. After this forest belt was crossed, further progress took place precisely along the forest belt in the direction of Chassiar. There was a second intersection of a strip, a forest belt, a road, and approximately in this area, it is precisely in this small gap that the most important thing happens. The column is divided into two parts. And how? If we go back to this video, we can look at it and approximately count about 10 cars. But just so you understand, out of these 10 cars, only 2 or 3 had personnel. That is, in the other 7, there was just a possible mechvid, that is, the driver, perhaps the driver, and the one who is responsible for the weapons in order to produce something there. But in general, only 3, maybe 4, maybe even 2 BES or armored personnel carriers were manned, all the others were empty. And this is the place, it turns out, here we are, where the columns are divided into 2 parts. Pay attention to this point, and in fact, only one BEHA continued to move further, in the direction of the Yar clock. Here even the drone was confused to some extent, based on the fact that there was a large number of Beks. It missed at some point an imperceptible advance as one Russian Beks slipped by, and now it flies into the very outskirts of the Yar clock, and the landing takes place. That is, here there is a division, and one Beha moves further towards the Yara chapel and reaches this area, this small groove of development. At least a fortified area of the Afu was located here in this area, and here the assault actions and attempts of the Russian Federation. Russian fighters to gain a foothold in the trench, knock out the positions of the Afu, and in general, as if trying to do something further, began. It was difficult to understand what the tasks of this group really were. A little later, literally within a couple of seconds, Beha was destroyed. She was left to burn down, seen in separate frames, and on individual frames. It was also possible to observe approximately the height positions. A small group of Vaisab was here, from where they immediately began to deliver counterfire on Russian attack aircraft, who were trying to gain a foothold directly in these trenches and in these trenches. That is, this was the situation and the meaning. The purpose of this operation is very difficult to understand, but again, most likely it was a distraction, perhaps an attempt to consolidate, perhaps just to take on the main gift. Why? Because, again, there were 10 cars, 4 of them. 3, 2, 4, 1. Well, more than 1, 2, 3, 4 were with personnel. All the others were empty. So, that is, the landing landed here, the beginning of consolidation. Meanwhile, the second group went along, let's say, along the forest belt, let's say, the return routes, in the direction of the same Bogdanovka, along the railway, in the direction of the railway station, possibly Valerianov. But somewhere here the frames disappear. That is, here it turns out that the folding, and further, it is not clear what happened to this group. She left, in which direction is also unknown. And let's sum it up again. It turns out, before we move on to the next stage, there was movement. It goes down south of the cemetery, moves along the cemetery, along the forest belt, crosses the forest belts again, moves back, moves towards the west, crosses this forest belt, reaches this point. There is a division going on here. One group goes further along this forest, in the direction of Bogdanovka, and only one Beka with personnel. Well, it unfolds very quickly, and moves in the direction of Chuzev Yar. And there is an amphibious landing here, an attempt to consolidate. In other words, this was an interesting operation. And a little later, just before we started recording this video, there were more shots of the same operation, but already dedicated to the second group of the paratrooper, the second group of the back, who went on exactly in the direction of Bogdanovka. Here, pay attention again. This is Beha, who moved further in the direction. Here it is in the direction. That is, it is a deceptive maneuver, like it turns off, and then returns. And now the second group enters this forest belt, and the most basic fighting begins to unfold here. Again, it is difficult to say exactly how many have landed, and how many have stopped here. Maybe 2, but no more than that. Out of 10 cars, 3 were full, 7 were empty, 7 came back, 1 may have been hit somewhere on the eastern outskirts. 2 more, at least 2, landed troops in this area, and further advance was carried out in this direction. In order to expand the bridgehead in this forest, spread their shoulders, possibly cross the railway, and, in general, try to gain a foothold here. This is how the operation was carried out. After that, after these shots, all the telegram channels began to say that an assault operation had begun in the hours of Yar. Everything was there. Well, of course, it has begun, definitely. But in general, we must clearly understand from all this configuration that it was not the main blow on one Bek, there with 7 paratroopers on board perhaps, and the main blow was driven, fell on this forest belt, which leads further into residential development, into a residential area. Here it turns out to be a dacha cooperative. The railway station is 36th kilometer, that's what it's called. And the main task was to go further, and try to gain a foothold, and enter here. Here is where to try to develop a bridgehead. Then from here, it is possible to try to cross the road in several places, and in general. Try to capture this area and continue to try to develop an offensive from here in the direction of the Yarov clock. That is somehow in this way to try to move forward in an elderly building, under the cover of buildings, under the cover of everything that can be used as some kind of minimal shelter from drone strikes, artillery strikes, and other things. Most likely, these fighters, after they had held out for some time, retreated, well, without Behi on their feet, through the forest to these Forest Street and further in the direction of Kromov. And in general, here it is an operation. Here is this battle for the clock yar. It's a very interesting deception maneuver, but I want to tell you what it is. Well, this. I will not say that this is a new tactic. You probably have been using it for a long time on the line in general, in a special military operation, but something like this has not been shown before. Earlier, 2 tanks drove in there, 3 Bez in the back, all packed with personnel, and also sat on the roof, on Mongolas, on the roof, on trunks everywhere, and someone was running up from behind. Yes, who had time? Well, now you see, they have changed tactics completely. There are large columns going, but almost all of them are empty. Only 1 or 2 with personnel, and which at the right moment stands out from the general column, begins to storm one or another landing there. Something similar just the other day, we observed in the area of Avdiivka. Yes, I'm just going to remind you of these shots again. It was already an offensive from Ukraine from Amansky. Here, pay attention to these frames. Here is a similar story, only performed by the Sun, much more sparsely from the point of view of the material part. Only 4, and not Behi, but perhaps some Max Proshky, left for the position towards the direction of the thin one. For Max Proshka's left, and 3 of them essentially turned around and went back, and from 1, there was an attempt to land troops. Here are 3 unfolding. From the bottom, it drives up to the forest belt, begins to deploy and land troops. In other words, this is an interesting tactic now. These are such interesting innovations, let's say, especially military operation, that we can consider in the execution of both one and the other side. Well, by the clock. Of course, among other things, various information is received from the northern flank in the Bogdanovka area, from the southern flank in the Ivanovo Red area, and including, of course, footage of strikes with the use of aviation, is published for an hour in Yar. Of course, the Fabs come here, they come here, they come here. Perhaps only ARBC 500 has not been published yet. So everything, the artillery, everything is flying here. Everything is gradually leveling up with the ground here. And the most important thing in this operation is that, of course, the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal is already under fire control. The possibility of evacuation of the replenishment of the Afu garrison at this site has already been practically minimized. But the ARBC 500, no, it's not 500, it's possible that the Su-25th worked out exactly in this part, namely, where the advanced first detachments of attack aircraft of the armed forces of the Russian Federation are likely to go. That is, everything is under control here, and already individual sources report that everything there may have been intercepted. For the evacuation requirement, then understand that the Apu garrison is sitting on this, in this patch, and the losses are constantly growing, and they need to be evacuated, and that's all. There is already a very, extremely low probability of a successful evacuation of 300 and 200. And that's why, according to separate sources on Earth, according to interceptions, it is reported that you are evacuating yourself. That is, you are trying to somehow withdraw yourself. And in general, the Apu will not fight for this block for a very long time here. Again, for the simple reason, a very difficult terrain, the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal. Russian troops are already, let's say, advancing on their heels, and no matter how much no one wants to stay here for a long time, yes. Therefore, it will most likely retreat to USU in the near future. If it is possible to expand the bridgehead along this forest, the railway, and already enter from the north in the direction of Koshevoy Street, there is Gorbatovka and Zeleny. And among other things, from this channel, the channel of the Novy Chas Yar quarter, separate shots are published of simply striking at the most, let's say, rear building in the direction. Most likely, the command centers, observation posts, let's say, are located at a safe distance from the place of the main hostilities. Here a fire defeat is inflicted, slowly everything is bombed, everything is destroyed. Well, of course we will observe this battle, how this battle will develop, but, I repeat once again, that it is for this part that the Apu will not be able to fight for a long time for a number of objective reasons. But again, if we rewind a little, let's say, it turns out to be the beginning of 2023 year, the end of 2022 year, the beginning of the battle for Bakhmut Artemev, then I remind you that the battle for Bakhmut Artemev began far from the fall of Soledar and the beginning of coverage. The battle for Bakhmut-Artemovsk began in due time for the battle for Patrick Lumumba Street. This is Patrick Lumumba Street, and it was at first, before the coverage of this settlement began from both the south and the north, that the Russian army established control over the industrial zone along Patrice Lumumba Street, and after that flank coverage began. Now, if we sort of drag the same pattern onto the clock, it happens the same way. The canal is the same Patrice Lumumba Street. Now there is a seizure of a bridgehead already within the boundaries of the settlement of the city itself, even if the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal is divided, after which the flanking coverage of Bogdanovka-Kalinovka and access to the railway will begin. It's in the south, of course, it's Ivanovskoye, and then there are steps, perhaps some N32 road, workshop number 2, dugouts and other stuff. But in general, the battle for is likely to be much shorter, compared to the same battle for Bakhmut, for the simple reason that it is smaller. Let it be possible that it will be more difficult to storm it at the first stages, but if some critical band is overcome, the offensive will be much easier to develop further. And among other things, the first shots began to arrive from Bogdanovka itself. The armed forces of the Russian Federation publish footage of artillery strikes, drone strikes, stripping of some trenches. It may have been difficult to provoke the video, but, in the last frames of this video, you can clearly see how the Apu fighters, perhaps surrounded, perhaps having lost hope for salvation, evacuation, throw out a white flag, and ask for mercy, pardon, how to say it correctly here, and accordingly, some positions in Bogdanovka have also been surrendered over the past few days. That is, the map definitely no longer corresponds to reality, and slowly Bogdanovka-Kalinovka begins to crumble. Of course, for a more confident and higher speed, higher rates of advance along Bogdanovka-Kalinovka, the Russian army would like, and would be worth taking control of this forest, then everything would begin to develop much faster. But with such a pace in general, everything will be carried out quickly enough. Then, we are moving with you to the Belogorskov direction, or rather, to be more precise, the Seversk direction. The next shots were published from the village of Razdalovka. The armed forces of the Russian Federation continue to launch artillery strikes on the outskirts of the settlement. Preparations are underway before further ground operations. The other day, we discussed the advance of the Russian army along the Bologorovka-Vyemka-Seversk railway, and there was an advance on both sides along the flanks on one side and on the other side of the railway. Today, footage of strikes on Razdalovka is being published again. That is, we should expect a ground operation in the village itself in the near future. There are a lot of important news on Bologorovka, a lot of important geolocations, reporting and so on. What should I pay attention to? As you can see, Bologorovka itself is already overlaid from all sides. Overlaid on all sides with frames. And where the other day, we discussed the advance of the Russian army, let's say from the south and southwest direction, is trying, as it were, an attempt to cover this, let's say, dump. And today, the footage of Rush today was published, and in these frames, we see with you the very process of the assault actions of the trench supports at the very foot of the chalk dump. That is, according to the footage, the Russian fighters from these forest belts managed to advance at the very foot, at the very base of the dump, and the advance goes further along the very border itself. Perhaps in this way, it is possible to avoid direct contact and direct aiming, let's say from the side, in a situation with a hill, since it is difficult to hit under the base, and it is possible in this way, along the very edge, along the very base of the dump, to bypass it from all sides, and in fact, surround it. Well, maybe. And at the same time, please note that shots of strikes and padrons continue to be published on the positions of the Apu, at the same time. Again at the base of the dump, on the supports, on the trenches, and so on. That is, in fact, there is now an attempt to further encircle, and in fact, cut off this dump from communication with Bologorovka. In case of successful cutting, this blade will cease to play any role. Perhaps a day, 2, 3, there is still resisting, but then the bull will simply run out, the food will end, everything will end. And either they will give up, or there will be attempts to break through in order to get out of the encirclement, or they will stay there forever. Of course, all this time, there will be regular counterattacks by the armed forces of Ukraine. To be more precise, most likely the 81st 54th Brigade will naturally counterattack regularly in order to restore control and prevent encirclement. However, in our entire previous experience of a special military operation suggests that if the Russian side has taken up some serious direction, then usually the matter is brought to an end. In these frames, we see with you how the main supply route Georgiivka-Bologorovka is under fire control. There was an attempt to fail, possibly to rotate, and during the artillery strike, cars were destroyed. In other words, this direction Soledar, Chaz Yar, Bakhmut, Artem, Soledar, Bologorovka is currently the most active and most promising in terms of further advances and further some interesting activizations here and some additional advances on Earth. Then, we are moving with you to the Avdiivka direction, from where a lot of interesting information also comes. Probably the most important information is the summary of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, and according to this summary, according to the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Army, it was possible to find out full control over the settlement of Vodyany. It is very important to understand the boundaries of settlements here. Vodyanaya, here, it is inhabited by Vodyanaya, and then there is Embankment Street. This Embankment Street ends here. It turns out, in the area of Staroavdiivsky Pond. That's right, up to here it's all watery. That's right, already south of this Staroavdiivsky Pond, the reservoir begins and goes Mayday. It starts, but it goes. That's why they didn't announce the capture of Vodyanova for so long, because it's a fairly long locality. And just the other day, it was possible to reach the very, very western outskirts. The Russian army has already established full control. In the USU over the past day, several attempts have been made to counterattack in this direction. For these purposes, a large number of equipment and personnel were involved. However, no sooner did the stormtroopers arrive at the positions than Russian troops immediately began to inflict fire damage on them, using all types of the entire range of weapons that are available, and as you can see, they hit in a heap, tightly right on target, and as a result of the strikes, of course, they suffered heavy losses. And even the operation ended before it started, and everything was there. Those who managed to return back in the direction of Nutalev, and in the direction of the same Yasnobrodovka. Individual cartographers report on the progress and establishment of control over individual fields, forest belts in the fields between the thin and the same water. That is, according to separate cartographers, Russian troops already control approximately this territory, continue to expand the bridgehead, clear the area for further offensive actions to the west. There is no news on Berdik, and on, say, Semenovka. Footage was published from the AFU of strikes in beer by disembodied people along the central street of the village of Semenovka, which in general, in other words, we made a small cut on the map as geolocation appeared confirming the impact. In other words, not a couple of houses have been designated as a territory under the control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. The fighting is more than continuing. There is no news on the western outskirts again. That is, we still think that we were right after all, asserting the fact that Berdik is still far from full control there, let's say, and there is still a lot of work to be done here. Then we move north to the direction of Osheretnev, in the area of the Osheretina-Daily Novokalinev railway interchange. Additional footage is being published about artillery strikes on strong points up warehouses on the ground. As a result of the strikes, detonation and fire occur, and in general, some kind of another warehouse was destroyed. The Russian army works quite tightly, for this very reason, to the triangle. Not in the last, let's say, a few weeks, shots have been repeatedly published from here. And it seems that perhaps the Russian command has plans for a breakthrough to this, let's say, area. To these, let's say, a dacha village at the intersection of the railway, so it is at a height. From here, in general, it is convenient to further control all movements and strikes on the positions of the heights around a given height. Then, we are moving with you to the Krasnogorsk direction. The fighting has quieted down here. Activity has been minimized as much as possible. The Russian army continues to strike with the use of FEBs. 1,500 people are constantly arriving. Drones are constantly flying here. There is a hunt for operators of FB buckets from the armed forces of Ukraine. In general, this is exactly the kind of work that is being carried out here. No advances on the ground, no attempts to storm, no attempts to introduce hostilities. The situation is similar in Maximilievka-Grigorievka. Here, of course, it is worth noting the gradual shift of the front further in the direction of Kharkiv. That is, it is possible that the situation is much worse in Georgievka. It is completely different, because you will notice, please note, that over the past few days, perhaps even weeks, news from Georgievka has stopped coming at all. That is, it is possible that there is a possibility that the Russian army has managed to advance much deeper. Along the positions in the USU, and perhaps even already in the USU, have rolled back from Georgievka itself, or occupy the most westerly, northwestern positions, and in general, further advancement of the armed forces of the Russian Federation does not make sense, since the main task of securing and reaching the operational space, and now there are attempts to destroy the AFU positions around this fortified area, in order to move further along the fields around Kharkiv, or to the south in the direction of Konstantinovka-Novomikhailovka. There is no news on Novomikhailovka, except for some cartographers assure that the Russian army has managed to advance slightly. That is, the entrance to the gray zone, the APU is already gradually retreating, and simply retreating positions. Russian armies are entering empty positions and gradually moving west as the sun retreats. Important news continues to come to us from Ugledar. Another day, another foe arrives in the area of the mine, let's say the southern mine number 1. Here is another FAP, another explosion, another 1,500 arrives. This frame, in my opinion, is the same shot from several angles. In general, these shots once again confirm to us that the Russian armed forces are too interested in this direction, which causes certain thoughts that in the near future, it is possible to intensify hostilities, and new attempts to storm the Russian armed forces from the position in Ugledar and Yuzhnaya mine. Southern number 1 of this one, yes. Artillery shelling of the advanced positions of the armed forces of Ukraine continues along the Great Novosalovka. Along the entire line of contact, strikes are being carried out west of Staromayorsky. A sweep is taking place. A springboard is being prepared for further offensive operations on the ground. Here is a large number of frames published. It arrives as artillery, it arrives as FABs, and it's simple and aviation works. And we see a similar story south of the harvest. Here, of course, the FABs arrive. In other words, the Russian army is working very actively in this direction as well. Including them, it is possible that in the near future, we should expect an intensification of hostilities. Attempts to attack from the enviable adoration and shelter in the direction of these two settlements. There is no news on the Orekhovsky direction. The front froze, even no shots are published here, and no one even comments on anything. There, some Ukrainian sources have published drone strikes, but which do not actually make any sense, and are just another such routine, nothing more.